All right, hey everyone again. So we're picking up with our introduction to logistic regression. We had talked about this interpretation for our slope coefficient after we do e to that coefficient estimate. We had talked about why that makes sense with some algebra. And now we're going to talk about some kind of issues with these odds interpretations. And so we mentioned before that the interpretations of these are somewhat problematic, mainly because most people in like the general public think that odds and probability are pretty much equivalent. And they're, at least in terms of this logistic regression model, they're definitely not equivalent. And so there's a couple links here. One is to a what I described as a saucy debate on Twitter about interpreting using odds or not. And then there's another blog post that's also linked here that discusses this issue. If you go and delve into that, you'll kind of see that opinions are generally divided on whether to interpret that slope coefficient with the odds ratio in general. And so let's rewrite what that actually meant just to remind ourselves what it was. And so this interpretation was something like one student increase in student faculty ratio is associated with a 1.7814 fold. Remember, fold, this just means like a multiplicative change, not an additive change. Fold change in the estimated odds that a college is public. Okay, so let's assume that whoever's reading this knows what this multiplicative change means. So that's kind of one hurdle, but we're not even really talking about that. We're talking about whether kind of the human mind can kind of interpret this multiplicative change in odds or not. And so the big issue is that when we've used odds like just generally in the past before stats, we've maybe thought about them as being equivalent to probability. I don't know if anyone like played that like odds are game in like middle school or high school or college, but that game where you say odds are you'll eat a spoonful of relish, or that, that was a that was a terrible example. I should have thought of something better before the video. But it's pretty much you dare someone to do something and then they give the odds that they're going to do it. But the problem is what they give in that game is not actually odds. So it just kind of adds to this confusion that odds has a specific meaning in stats that is just not used in the general public. So an alternative to interpreting that odds coefficient would be to just provide the fitted graph. So like I've done that here, and kind of make the assumption that people can interpret probabilities much more easily than they can interpret odds. And another strategy would be if you don't maybe have space for a graph or want to provide some more numerical evidence in addition to the graph, would just be to kind of provide some predicted probabilities for a range of student to faculty ratios in your data set. So in this example, I'm getting the 20th percentile to represent kind of a low, kind of like a low student to faculty. I'm grabbing the median, which is the 50th percentile, and then I'm grabbing something that's meant to represent a high student to faculty ratio as the 80th percentile. I picked these just, you could do the 15th, 50th, and 85th, or whatever you really want to do. And then for those values, maybe I would want to provide some predicted probabilities that the university is public. And so these, as output, are predicted probabilities that a university is public. So for example, we would predict that the probability of a school being public for a high student to faculty ratio of 18 is 0.55. So again, this is kind of a matter of opinion. It's just another way to kind of um, present results. And you could, again, if you're home with family or if you have friends around or whoever, you could think about what they would more easily understand. And I think most people would probably agree that this second way is a little bit easier to understand than this odds ratio interpretation. And so we're going to kind of be responsible for knowing both because this odds ratio interpretation is very, very, very common still. But it's just something to think about who your audience is and what they would benefit most by. Okay, so that's about it for that. Definitely for this, especially this part, let me know if you have any questions because I didn't really talk about this last semester. And so I'm curious if this kind of issue is making sense or not. All right, so have a great morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever.